Hello, welcome back to my channel. My name is Grace. It is lovely to have you here as always. It's a bit of a moody, gloomy day, so the lighting is kind of weird, but we're going with atmospheric. That's the vibe. So recently I have been doing monthly wrap-ups for the first time because in the past I've never been able to read enough that I could sustain a monthly wrap-up and have enough books to talk about every month. And in the last couple of months that has caught up with me a little bit because I have been reading a little bit slower. In June I only read 4 books and in July I read 5, so I decided it would be better to just kind of accumulate the two and make a summer wrap-up instead of monthly ones. So I have 9 books to talk about today. So I guess let's get into it. The first book that I read in June was Even Though I Knew the End by C.L. Polk. This is a novella. I listened to the audiobook of this one and I think it was only about 4 hours long. But this is a magical realism set in a version of 1940s Chicago where there is magic. It's sort of based in demons and angels and their influence, and our main character is a bit of a detective. They have some magical ability, but you begin to learn their backstory and how they ended up in this situation. She is offered one last job before the deal that she made years ago to bargain away her soul comes back to bite her and her soul is taken. She has a very short timeline. This is her last ditch effort to see if she can solve this case to earn back a second chance at her life. This is also a sapphic romance and I really enjoyed the exploration of LGBTQ history, what it was like at that time living under the radar, the sort of underground speakeasies. It does have some darker themes obviously because at that time you would be persecuted if you were found to be queer, so I would look up trigger warnings if you think that that might not be something you're comfortable with, but overall I really enjoyed this one. I wouldn't say it's the deepest read I've ever read. It was pretty speedy, obviously only 4 hours long, but the vibes were really set up and I really liked the voice of the main character. She really felt like she fit into that setting and she could have been a real character from that time period, only with magic as well. I think especially if you enjoy when lots of different genres converge, because obviously this has some historical fiction elements, some fantasy to it, and then a bit of a mystery plot as well as the romance. There's a lot going on in here in such a short space of time, and if you enjoy those things being woven together, I would definitely give this one a try. So that is Even Though I Knew the End by C.L. Polk. Next was the first of the graphic novels that I read in this selection. I've read quite a few graphic novels in these couple of months, and this was a very cute short one. I actually got this one out of the library, and this is Fangs by Sarah Andersen. This is a love story between a werewolf and a vampire, but it was mostly told in sort of humorous little vignettes of their life rather than one cohesive story, although all of these different moments did kind of build together to show a picture of what their relationship growing looked like. This was very light-hearted and silly and fun, and the art style I really enjoyed. The copy that I had of this was such a lovely kind of cloth-bound book that almost felt like a vampiric tome and then was full of just such cute vibes with a slightly dark twist to the humour because obviously vampires and werewolves, but a very cute read. It did not take me long to get through at all, but if you just want a little bit of a dose of joy and you like those kind of spooky cozy things, then you really can't go wrong with this one. So that is Fangs by Sarah Andersen. The next book I got to was another library pick, and I talk about this in more depth in the library reading vlog that I did last month, so if you want to hear my reaction to reading this one, I'll link that one below. But this book was such a random pick for me because it's almost a thriller. It definitely has some of those aspects to it, and that is definitely not what I go for. I'm a huge wimp, so I tend to avoid anything too spooky and scary, but something about this was calling to me, and I'd heard really good things about the writing style, so I just was in the mood for it and decided to pick it up from the library, and I'm so glad I did because I really enjoyed it. So this is The Last Tale of the Flower Bride by Roshani Chokshi. I really need to get my own copy now because I really loved this one. This is the story of a man who falls in love with an heiress to a hotel company. She's very wealthy and lives a very decadent life, and they find a mutual passion in folklore and fairy tales and just living their lives in the most whimsical ways possible. So they end up getting married, but the woman makes her husband promise never to pry into her history and her background. But of course, something comes about that means they have to travel back to her hometown and visit the house that she grew up in, which is incredibly atmospheric and has a presence that almost feels like a character in itself. And our main character, the husband, who I don't believe is ever actually named, I think he's just called the husband throughout this book, which is really interesting. But he begins to struggle with keeping his promise as the house lures him in and begins to unravel her secrets. This is such an atmospheric story, which is exactly what I was looking for when I picked this up. The writing in here is so lush and opulent, and it is quite flowery. I'll warn you of that right now, but I've said this before, I think it's quite a deliberate choice because the characters in here are incredibly pretentious and the whole book is a commentary on some classist themes because one of our main characters is incredibly wealthy and they use their money in many questionable ways, but this very much explores the way that these characters feel like they can justify anything as long as it is poetic and beautiful in some way. So to me it made perfect sense for the writing to be so flowery and pretentious because that was the point of the narrative, if that makes sense. I personally love a bit of purple prose. This one also explores a toxic female friendship that definitely has queer undertones. It's a very complicated, messy relationship, and in general in this book you can just feel things spiraling as you read and as you discover more. It has such an ominous pace to it that just makes you want to keep reading because that atmosphere is pulling you through. I had such a great time with this one, and part of me wonders if that's because I was so surprised that I was enjoying a book that was kind of a thriller. This is also often shelved within fantasy, so this is one of those ones where the genres kind of merge together, which I've really been enjoying recently. But if you enjoy really decadent writing and creepy houses and unhealthy relationships and that kind of dark fairy tale vibe, then I really can't recommend this one enough. I had such a great time with The Last Tale of the Flower Bride by Roshani Chokshi. The next book that I read was another graphic novel, and this was The Tea Dragon Festival by Kay O'Neill. This is the second book in the Tea Dragon series. I thought the first one was so cute, so I was excited to get to the second one, and I still have the third one to read, but it's on my shelf. This is a series set in a world where dragons are real and they sprout leaves or flowers or something that can be turned into tea if handled in the right way. And this tea is even more magical because if you bond with these tea dragons, then when you harvest and brew their tea, it will show you memories as you drink it of the time that you shared together. This is such a sweet concept, and these books are just very sweet and wholesome. What I hadn't realised is that this book is separate from the first one. It's not a series in that the story continues between all three. They're just set in the same world. So while I did enjoy this one, I think I was more invested in the first book and I'd kind of been hoping for a bit more of that story. But this is set in a different town and is about a dragon, this time a dragon rather than a tea dragon, who was meant to be the guardian of this town, but for magical reasons has ended up falling asleep for many years in the forest. Because of this, he feels very guilty for not having fulfilled his duty, and it deals with those themes of not living up to what you promised you would, feeling like you don't fit in, and it's just so wholesome in the way that it deals with those themes. This was a very sweet read, and I would definitely recommend these ones if you like cozy fantasy, but I will say that I definitely preferred the first book. I'm curious to see what I'll think of the third one. The art style in these is also so cute. I think the colour palettes chosen are so lovely and warm and cozy. So yeah, if you like dragons and cozy vibes, you can't go wrong with the Tea Dragon Society books. So that was The Tea Dragon Festival by Kay O'Neill. Now we got to the start of July, and the first book I read in July was another graphic novel. I hadn't planned on reading this, but I work at a library, and over the summer we put on a lot of kids activities, and me and one of my co-workers ran a cartoon comic making activity, and we gathered together a lot of comics from the library to use as examples, and then we had to draw some ourselves. So I picked this one up while I was at work just to have a speedy read through and see if I could use it as inspiration for my own comic. Dang it, I should have picked it up from work. It was not very good though. I ended up drawing basically a retelling of Goldilocks and the Three Bears, but with a butterfly trying to find the perfect flower. These were not highbrow comics. So it ended up being mostly irrelevant because this comic is far too beautiful and intricate for me to ever vaguely attempt to recreate. But the next book I read was Nightlights by Lorena Alvarez Gomez. This is such a gorgeous graphic novel. The illustrations in here I just can't get enough of. They're so beautiful. And this is the story of a little girl who absolutely loves to draw, and she has such a vivid imagination. She can doodle so many things, but sometimes her doodling gets her into trouble because she won't pay attention at school, or she'll stay up too late drawing. And she also kind of struggles to make friends at school because she's kind of in her own world. But one day a new girl comes over to her and praises her for her drawing, tells her how wonderful she is, and wants to be friends. Things begin to spiral from here. It becomes pretty unclear whether this new girl is actually real or part of her imagination. This again is a very short read, but I did not expect it to be as deep as it was. This graphic novel is definitely marketed at children, but as I was reading it, I think it had a lot of interesting layers to it. To me, it felt like a discussion of praise in terms of craft, and how sometimes too much praise for a fun hobby that you have can ruin it in some way and put pressure on it that wasn't there before. Very much the kind of gifted and talented kid syndrome that a lot of us creatives have, and that's definitely an issue that I personally have struggled with a lot. If you've seen my writing videos, you know. So I really wasn't expecting this book to hit as hard as it did and feel so emotionally interesting to me. I just thought it would be a cute, pretty read, but it was actually a really interesting exploration of those themes. I definitely want to read more by this author. I know they have another one, at least another one in this series, and I'm interested to see where things might go from here. But yeah, a surprisingly interesting read for one that I just picked up on a whim because I was doing a cartoon event at work. So that is Nightlights by Lorena Alvarez Gomez. The next book I picked up is the first one that I actually read off of my physical TBR that I really need to get back to focusing on. And this was Lies We Sing to the Sea by Sarah Underwood. Now, this book has some controversy surrounding it. A lot of people were really excited to read it. This was marketed as a sapphic retelling of the Odyssey, but I think before the book even came out, the author admitted in an interview that they'd never actually read the Odyssey, and a lot of people were very unhappy about that. Now, I personally have also never read the Odyssey, so I had nothing to compare this to, and I had no real grounding and need for it to be accurate to that. I don't know if you would have a completely different experience with this book if you had read the Odyssey or you were just really well versed in Greek mythology, but to me, I think this was just mismarketed. This is not a retelling of the Odyssey at all. It is set centuries after the Odyssey, so the history of this world is very much influenced by that story, but it's not a retelling. In this setting, every year 12 girls are marked by Poseidon for death and hanged in order to save this land from the wrath of the sea. And our main character is one of the girls who is hanged at the beginning of the book, but for some reason death cannot claim her, and she ends up washed up on another island with a girl called Melantho, who tells her that the only way to break this curse is to go back to her hometown and kill the prince. I have such mixed feelings about this book. It was very much not a perfect book, and there were some parts that dragged a little bit, there were some plot points that were a little bit weak, I think, but I would say that the writing was good, and this did make me cry quite a bit by the end. I'm not going to spoil anything, obviously, but there is a very interesting romance structure in here because there is a bit of a sapphic romance, but our main character, who is meant to be killing the prince, also begins to find out that he's not so bad. So there's kind of a love triangle, but kind of... I don't know how to describe it. This was a strange book, and I really don't know whether I recommend it or not. I think if you need the historical accuracy and a really solid plot, then I wouldn't recommend this one. But if you like kind of just the vibes of a Greek mythology retelling with sapphic elements that has a heavy melancholia to it, then I would still recommend this one. I thought it was well written and it did emotionally impact me. I don't know if I would read anything from this author again in the future. I know they're bringing another one out, but I think this was a very mixed bag for me and I still don't really know how I feel. If you have read this, I would absolutely love to know what you thought. I have such mixed feelings. So that is an inconclusive review of Lies We Sing to the Sea by Sarah Underwood. Next up, I read what is probably my favourite book of the year so far, and that was Book Lovers by Miss Emily Henry. Now, I have heard so many good things about this one. Everyone seems to love Book Lovers. Out of her books, it's one of the most popular ones, and after having read Funny Story earlier this year and not loving it, I was a bit nervous, but I didn't need to be. I absolutely adored this book. This is a romance between a literary agent and a literary editor who are kind of rivals in their field, but not so much rivals as they just kind of get on each other's nerves. Our main character is very much a city girl and has a history of losing boys to the classic country tropes of city boy travels to the countryside, ends up learning a new way of life and falling for the local girl who runs a failing Christmas tree farm business, or something along those lines. Far too many of our main character's exes have left her for those kind of reasons, but in this story, her sister drags her on her own countryside getaway, but to her surprise, when she ends up in this little picturesque town in the country, her rival from the city is there. I absolutely loved the themes that were explored in this one. I loved the relationship between the main character and her sister, although the sister did get on my nerves occasionally. One of my favourite things about Emily Henry is that her books don't solely focus on the romance. The other characters in her books are still important and well-rounded and aren't just there to further the romantic plot. I often find that those moments with other characters are the ones that really hit me in her books. But I did also love the romantic relationship in here. As always, Emily Henry is great at writing banter and just the developing tension and feelings between a couple. This was also quite an inspiring read for me in the way that they talk about books and the publishing industry. The love that both of these characters had for stories and for editing them into a place that they can really shine and be the best version of a story. I found myself, as I was reading this, really itching to pick up a pen and get back into my own writing. And I think a book that can do that is so impressive. This did, once again, make me cry quite grossly. I was also sick at the time, so it was very snotty. It was not pretty at all. But this is definitely going high up there on my Emily Henry ranking. It didn't quite beat Happy Place because I don't know if anything will ever beat Happy Place for me. That book was just so personally tuned to me, it felt like, but it was a pretty close second, I would say. I think currently we're looking at Happy Place, Book Lovers, Beach Read, Funny Story. I am intrigued to see what People We Meet on Vacation, or You and Me on Vacation, depending on where you are, will be like for me, because I've heard not so great things about that one. But I am so glad that Happy Place was not a fluke for me, and Emily Henry has definitely just solidified herself as one of my favourite authors. So that is Book Lovers by Emily Henry. The next book that I finished, I actually started back in June because I wanted to read this for Pride Month, but for some reason I struggle to get through middle grade books quickly, which is strange because they're often very short. So I ended up finishing this one in July, but this is The Secret Sunshine Project by Benjamin Dean. This is the story of a family, especially two sisters. The younger sister is called Bee and the older sister is called Riley. And at the beginning of this book, Riley comes out to her family and they're all very supportive. It's lovely, and they go to Pride together in London. But soon after Pride, their father passes away, and because of financial issues after this, they end up having to move out to the countryside with their grandma for the next summer, so they cannot go to London Pride this year. This is obviously a very hard time for the family. They're coming around to the anniversary of their father's death, and Pride last year was the last time that they had a happy day together as a family, so the fact that they can't go this year is really tearing them up emotionally. So Bee decides that to cheer her older sister up, she is going to host her own Pride in the little town that they're in the countryside. This is such a sweet book of a community coming together, family learning to rely on each other, and how they all deal with their grief in different ways. The friendships that are made in here are so sweet. It's just so wholesome. There are of course some difficulties in putting this event together. There are a few people, especially one in particular, who are very angry about this event being set up. The villain in this book is oof, just the worst. But in the end, this is a delightfully joyful read. I will say I think the ending was a tiny bit anticlimactic after it had all been built up. It felt like a lot of time was spent on creating the setting and the backstory, and we ended up with not much time for the actual fulfillment of this idea at the end. But at the same time, is it really that deep? Probably not. It's just a cute little middle grade with some great representation in there. It was really lovely to see these characters being able to come out and just be accepted for who they are by their family, and the relationship between these two sisters was so lovely and wholesome. So if you just want a bit of queer joy, this is definitely a good one to go for. So that is The Secret Sunshine Project by Benjamin Dean. And the last book that I read in July, finally I got to Emily Wilde's Map of the Otherlands by Heather Fawcett. Now, I absolutely adored the first book in this series, Emily Wilde's Encyclopedia of Fairies. If you don't know, this is a fantasy series set in our world, but a version of our world where fairies are very much known to exist, and the main character studies them at university. I believe this is also set in the early 1900s, so it has that historical aspect to it that I really enjoy. Now, I won't go into too much depth plot-wise because obviously I don't want to give spoilers. If you have not read this series, I absolutely think you should, especially if you enjoy historical fantasy or kind of cozy fantasy. I will say this is marketed kind of as a cozy fantasy, and in the actual storytelling, the way that it's written, I would say yes, it's very whimsical. The writing style is lovely and the characters are flawed in a very fun and cozy kind of way. But it does have some dark moments in here and some spooky things happen. These are the kinds of fae that are kind of terrifying. So it's not cozy in a Legends and Lattes kind of way of we're just chilling, having a cozy time. There is a plot and it can be spooky at times. I will say I was kind of hoping for a little bit more from this one. I'd heard really good things. I'd heard quite a few people say they preferred this to the first book, and I definitely didn't. I had a good time, I enjoyed myself, but I think the first half kind of dragged for me. It didn't feel like there was enough tension that had been rebuilt from the closure of the first book, if that makes sense. We'd answered a lot of questions but not asked that many new ones yet, and although I was having a good time with these characters, I didn't feel that much of an impetus to keep reading At first, the second half of the story definitely picked up and there was a lot more going on, but I was hoping to be a little bit more hooked because I devoured the first book in a couple of days, but this one took me quite a while to get through in the end. I definitely would still recommend it, and I am very excited to get to the third and final book, I believe, in the series. I love Emily as a character. I think that she is grouchy in the best way, and Wendell, again, giving the Howl from Howl's Moving Castle vibes eternally. So a fun time for me, not quite what I was hoping for, but I still really enjoyed and would recommend this series. So Emily Wilde's Map of the Otherlands by Heather Fawcett. So that is all my summer reading so far. I'm hoping that August will be a bit more of a big reading month for me, so I might be able to do an end of August wrap up, we will see. But at the same time, I still haven't hit a 5-star this year. I haven't found a new favourite. I've had a lot of pretty decent books. I've had a good few that I really liked, but I think I've had better reading years before in terms of my personal enjoyment. So I don't want to force myself to read just loads of books instead of actually focusing and maybe going for the ones that are going to take me a little bit longer, but I think I will actively really love. I'm especially noticing more throughout this year that although I love audiobooks, I don't think that full-on fantasy works for me in audiobook form. So I would like to read some more physical fantasy books. I think that that just helps me absorb the world building a lot better, even though it takes me quite a bit longer to read a book physically than to listen to one. But things have definitely picked up in the last couple of months compared to the months before, so I'm hoping it's an upward trajectory from here. We're gonna find loads of new favourite books in the second half of the year, fingers crossed. I would love to hear how your summer reading has been so far. Have you found any new favourites yourself, or has it been a bit of an summer? Either way, I hope you're having a lovely day, a lovely week, a lovely summer, and I will see you in another video very soon. Bye bye.